Hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar from IPlytics. What do FRAND experts think about SEP valuation? We will give it a few more minutes to let people in and show you a short video meanwhile and get started right after.
Are you ready for the next technological revolution? It's right around the corner. Smart homes, smart factories, and even smart cities. A revolution that will rely on connected technologies like 5G, 6G, Wi-Fi 6, and many others, where technical standards and standard essential patents are at its core. Amidst this new revolution, if you think your industry will remain unaffected, think again. Enabling almost any use case of the future will need reliance on telecommunication standards and their relevant standard essential patents. And chances are, it will affect your industry too. So are you ready for it? Do you have the required freedom to operate for your next interconnected product? Do you have the latest SEP data and analysis to guide your FRAND licensing negotiations and make sure you're not being taken advantage of? Are you proactively assessing your baseline royalty rates? Being informed requires sifting through thousands of patents and standards documents and creating manual linkages between them. This can take months. How do you keep up with this rapidly changing landscape? At IPlytics, we recognize these challenges and have created a solution that makes it incredibly simple to be better informed about your freedom to operate, your competition, and your industry. With IPlytics, you have the right arsenal to take to your next FRAND licensing deal. IPlytics is the only tool on the market to comprehensively unite the world of patents, SEPs, and technical standards in a single platform. With our premier intelligence solution behind your back, you have everything you need to adapt to this new technological revolution. Let us be your competitive advantage. Learn more at IPlytics.com and get in touch today.
Another warm welcome everyone to today's webinar. What do FRAND experts think about SEP valuation? I'm really happy to have here really great experts to join me in this. But let me get started with some of the housekeeping rules for you to understand. We have a chat box here, and I really encourage you to use that chat box. If you have any questions in the discussion of the panel, I will make sure we keep some time at the very end I will read out some of these questions and address the panel to it. Also, worth knowing that this webinar will be recorded and will be made available on our website under IPlytics.com past events. You will find it there, but everyone who's registered will also get a link sent to you afterwards. Also a disclaimer here, like always, IPlytics is hosting events with experts from many different industries and many different, I would say, camps. Today, as many of you did see from our great experts panel, we put a focus and perspective of the licensors point of view, while in other webinars we also had a lot of licensees and panels, or also pure licensees panels, where we looked at their perspective. IPlytics is a platform to allow the neutral and open discussion on these kind of topics. Which brings me to our guest today. And I'm really happy to really have one of the most knowledgeable people in the world of SEPs and FRAND licensing here. We have a good balance here of lawyers and economists. Let me start alphabetically here with Bo Hayden, who's a professor at the CIP in Sweden and Berkeley. Right now, I understand, Bo, you are in Sweden. We have here Clemens Heusch, who is the VP of litigation at Nokia. We have here Richard Vary, who is a partner with Bird & Bird, and we have Joche Patia, who is a senior director at Compass Lexicon. A very warm welcome to all of you guys. Thank you for joining and supporting this. I'm really to have you here today. We will discuss today two sets of questions here, and I will stop those slides because I want to see your faces mainly. One will be about transparency and different areas of that. About claim charting, about SEP disclosures in general, and NDAs. And the second part will go about the licensing and the efficiency of it. Where the license and value chain, should there be regulation on it, and how do licensors and licensees could come at terms. To get started, I really would love to have our panel to introduce yourself and start with a punchline, something that you want the audience, to understand from our topics today, what they should be remembering or as a starting discussion point. And I'm starting again, alphabetical order here. Bo, you want to, get started and introduce yourself.
All right. Well, yeah, my name is Bo Hayden, and I'm co-director of the Center for Intellectual Property in Gothenburg, Sweden, and also a director at the Tusher Initiative at UC Berkeley. My focus on this, when I think of valuation, you say a punchline, and I know Jorge thinks this way as well, is that price, of course, is critical, right? Lots of things come down to price, and then I would add norms to that. So it's easy to see that there's that price point where all these issues that we talk about, transparency, whether it's essentiality and validity or level of licensing, there's a price point where all this fades away, right? So no one's ever challenged the validity or essentiality of an SEP that's been offered for a royalty-free license, right? So somewhere between zero and what people are willing to accept on the market, all these other issues start to come into play. So we need to think that, are these issues that mean something in themselves, or is it just about a negotiation of price? However, when we move into IoT, we have to worry about norms as well, because the telecommunications industry has its own norms, and now we move into new industry verticals. And now we have this clash of norms, which we've seen in automotive. But this also gives us an opportunity now, as we move into new areas, to negotiate this and try to find ways that things can be improved as we move to the future. So I'm optimistic on that.
Thank you so much, Bo. Clemens, you want to take it away?
Yes, happy to do so. So I think Bo said exactly the right thing. It's in the end about money. That's something we all must be clear about. And so I think whoever supports, for example, SSPPU doesn't probably do it because he thinks it's such a fantastic concept, but he does it because he thinks that way he gets a lower price. And the other way around, those who want to license high up in the value chain probably also do it mainly because they think that there they can get a better price rather than academic beliefs or something like that. In the end, the decisive thing is that R&D must pay out, that those people who invest in the technology, who make it available to others, should get fairly awarded for that. And the question is, how do we make it work? How do we find the right place? Where do we license? These are all legitimate questions. Probably most people would agree that licensing on one point in the value chain makes sense. It's more difficult to find agreement on what is that place in the value chain and who can choose that place. We believe that the licensor has the freedom to decide where he wants to license within the value chain, as long as that way he gives access to all, but we know that this is controversial. And then when it comes to the value, in the end, you see, I don't care whether we get, just as an example, 10% from 100 or 1% from 1,000, if the result is in the end the same. But of course, I think it should be a fair award for the value which the patent adds to, which the technology adds to the end product, because only at the end product anything has value, because you cannot do anything with a chip, you cannot do anything with a TCU, you only can do something with the end product. And so therefore, I think that's where you have to look at the value. And if you would apply that value, no matter where in the value chain you license, I think then a lot of the heat would be taken out of all these discussions.
Great, thank you, Clemens. Richard, you're next.
Hi, I'm Richard Very. I'm a partner at Bird & Bird. For many years before that, I was in industry. I was at Nokia, so I have a background in the area. My take-home point from all of this is there is an awful lot of criticism of the cellular space and the lack of transparency, the late disclosures, where in the value chain you license, whether NDAs should be in place or not. And a perception is that none of it's working. The reality is actually on cellular SEPs, it's working remarkably well. We can today, it was very different when I joined the industry in 2006. We really did not know what we were doing. There was very little information, but today we have remarkably accurate information about cellular SEPs, about who owns them, and you could pretty accurately predict a reasonable royalty rate for pretty much any of the patent owners with a little bit of effort. So my take-home point is, let's stop bashing cellular. If we're going to do anything, let's bring all of the other standards up to the same levels of transparency and understanding that we now have in cellular. And that's where we should be focusing our efforts rather than bashing what's going on in the cellular area.
Great, Richard. Thank you so much for your take on this. Last but not least, Joche, you want to go next?
Thank you, Tim. So I'm Jorge Padilla. I'm the head of Compass Lexicon in EMEA. And I've been working on a number of matters concerning standard essential patents for pretty long time. So, I think that indicates how old I am. I think that I started working on this, more than 15 years ago, possibly 20 years ago. And I've learned a few things in that process. Still have a number of things to learn, but I think that during those years, I've learned a few self-evident truths. One is that the licensors want to make as much money as possible by licensing their technologies. Second self-evident truth is that licensees want to pay as little as possible in order to be able to use those technologies. The third lesson is that then we need to make sure that we have the proper institutions in place so that at the end, the negotiation between the two ends up with an outcome that aligns with the incentives of society. And that means that we need to make sure that there are incentives to innovate, and then at the same time that the royalties do not deter the diffusion of technologies. And as my predecessors have mentioned, at the end of the day, that involves determining what is the value of the patent portfolios that are going to be licensed. Lots of the debates that we have had over the last 20 years, whether injunctions should be in or out, whether we should license at this level of the patent of the value chain or the other, are proxies for the real discussion, which is about valuation. And unfortunately, I think that we have not made that much progress about valuation methods. We rely on comparables, and there is a lot to be said positively about comparables, but perhaps more discipline should be imposed on the way that comparables analysis are made, so that at the end of the day, it's not like tastes that it depends on the color, it depends on who is looking at those contracts that one conclusion emerges or the other. We have over the years talked about top-down methodologies, etc., and there are lots of issues involving those methodologies, problems that perhaps could be solved, problems that perhaps could not be solved. I think that we need to spend a little bit more time thinking about valuation methods to help both parties when negotiating, and also arbitrators and judges when making their decisions. That's the key issue, and I'm looking forward to discussing with all of you about how we get it better.
Okay, thank you so much for your input here. And that's exactly where we want to get started, because there has been some calls, especially from regulators, that apparently some more transparency is needed. I think also some licensees called for that, even licensors sometimes call for that there should be more transparency in the market in terms of who owns actual essential patents. And one proposal here is that there should be something they call a certified essential patent database. So a database that to a certain extent hosts information and actual claim charts to identify which companies actually have a case in the market that have essential patented technology. And I think there's two ideas here. One is to have at least, a few number of patents charted so you can understand who has a case and who is actually a licensor. And the other idea is even that all of the patents that are essential should be somewhere hosted, so you can even also see the share of those essential patents. And that's one of the topics I would love to get started with. Is that an idea that makes sense to a certain extent? What is your take on that proposal?
So do you want me to start there, Tim?
Please go ahead, Richard.
Ideally, you can see that if you were entering into a licensing transaction, it would be really nice if one of the other, the counterparty had all of their claim charts set out and you could have a look at them. The problem is that what we have to look at is all of the money that goes into R&D is ultimately coming from royalties, and all of the royalties are ultimately coming from the customers. And so you have a choice. You can either try and have the most efficient process where money that comes from the consumer, the customer, that gets taken through royalties is maximized back into the R&D, or you can have a process where some of it is siphoned off into lawyers and patent attorneys and other administrative people like us in order to try and improve transparency or manage disputes or all of these sorts of things. And every time you add a little layer like this, then you start to increase the cost, or you reduce the amount of money that's taken from the royalties that goes forward into R&D. And just doing a bit of maths on the back of an envelope, If let's say there's 100,000 standard essential patent families and a claim charting each one is 10,000 euros, there's €1 billion that is being taken out of the consumer's pocket and is not going into R&D, it's going into the pockets of lawyers, people like me. And that's great for one part of the industry, the lawyers, and it's not really good for the consumers, and it's not very good for the engineers. So there's a balance here. Claim charting everything is expensive, and it just reduces the cash available to R&D. And the other alternative is, don't worry about that, wait and see if there's a dispute, and only in the circumstances where there is a dispute do you start to worry about looking at the patents and claim charts and having some sort of independent tribunal analysing them. And if in licensing there are disputes in only 1% of cases, we would save an awful lot of money by taking that approach. And so I can see the strong arguments against some sort of mandatory claim charting, because I think it may well be cheaper to avoid it.
Tim, if I can add to that, I also think that this doesn't really add so much to claim chart everything. It's a huge cost amount, as Richard says, but especially I don't think that it helps finding the right solutions, because let's say these claim charts are also not binding. Just assume that a licensor, patent owner claim charts 100 patents, shows this to a potential licensee, and he just disagrees. He says, I think this claim chart is wrong. I disagree. And even if there is a neutral body doing that, we know from litigation that we had some individual patents where dozens of lawyers on both sides were fighting about one single patent over several years, and then one court first instance saw it that way, the appeal court saw it the other way around, and on the second appeal maybe again like the first court. So we should not assume that we get absolute certainty with some claim charts. The other point is that I think we just have to accept that FRAND is a range, and that you will never find the perfect point. There will always be some uncertainties, some inaccuracies. But what is the alternative? Not coming to any reasonable solutions within reasonable time and for reasonable money, that may be also not better. So therefore, I think we have to accept some uncertainties, and there might be more efficient ways to come to relatively good outcomes. And there are some studies, for example, who do evaluate portfolios, and there's a number of other possibilities where we can come, I think, more easily, more efficiently to an acceptable result.
What do you guys think about the other option, that just a few claim charts enough to basically provide evidence that you have essential patents in your portfolio, which is something that if you have a licensing program, at least someone would assume you anyways have in your, at no extra cost, to put it that way. Is that something you could get around, or is that an idea that would make sense in a way, or maybe why that still wouldn't?
I think that does make sense, and certainly that would be the practice, that people would exchange some claim charts, but probably not claim chart the entire portfolio.
And would a central database help there, or is it what you said in the beginning, that we should look at this case by case? I mean, we have also a lot of licensing going on, and there's no litigation and there's no dispute around it. It's just pure negotiation, right?
Yeah, you see, I never really understood what these technical discussions are good for, to be completely honest. Just because, let's say, if you have a portfolio of 1, of 2, or 3 patents, I completely understand that the potential licensee wants to get an understanding. Do I need a license under these patents, or do I just say no, thank you? I completely understand that. But if you look at the big portfolios, the 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 patents, I think nobody in the industry would seriously deny that he needs a license from Qualcomm or Ericsson or Nokia. And so therefore, I think it doesn't make sense to reduce it to 10 claim charts, because I was asked sometimes, so are these your 10 best patents? And then I always say, no, they're all good. And especially it's difficult to say these are the 10 best patents, because if I, of course, attack these 10 patents with unlimited resources, I might find something, and only after litigation, you know how good these patents are. And you see, there was also an idea by the Munich court sometimes to have an adjustment clause. And by the way, just to say they dropped that idea because they understood that this is not really helpful. So they had this idea that you make a proud list of 10 patents, and then these 10 patents are tested in court, and then this kind of mirrors on the license rate. So let's just assume the broadest case where you invalidate 10 out of 10, then you would be paying 0. Is that fair if you just happen to be able to invalidate 10 Qualcomm patents that you say, okay, now I get the 4,990 other patents for free? I don't think that's the right approach. That's the reason why I think an economic approach is maybe better than looking at such a subset, at least for the big portfolios.
It seems to be, this is one of these ideas that when you hear it, and especially people who are not really focused on this topic like the rest of us have to live this every day, that you think it sounds pretty good, right? But you have these issues that have been raised here that number one, there is no absolute answer. So you would have a database of supposition, right, where everyone could look and continue to argue and discuss about it. Number one. Number two, you don't have to look at everything, as Clemens said, to understand what's going on. For people with large portfolios, you could easily have a statistical approach, and maybe for those that have a few. And then the last point that's important is that even if you did know this, would this actually bring forward FRAND licensing and solve holdout and other issues much quicker? And if it doesn't, then it's just, it's a means, it doesn't improve the ends, right? So certainly if you burdened one group to spend $1 billion, if we use Richard's back of the envelope, then you would have to say, well, once this is out there, you have like 15 days to pay or you're unwilling. You would have to at least balance it on the other side at the very least, but I'm not sure that this is going to do a lot, even though it sounds good on the surface.
So what I would add to the discussion is that to some extent, the need to produce claim charts for each and every patent is, I believe, driven by, or it could be driven by two factors. One is, actually maybe opportunistic, while they are doing all these, they cannot ask for royalties, and then, the whole thing will be delayed. Maybe that's not the answer. Maybe that's too cynical on my part. Maybe the reason why some people argue that we would need to claim chart every single patent and determine in particular whether they are essential or not is because they have a valuation model in mind. And that's the top-down valuation model, in which you have an aggregate royalty, and then you apportion that aggregate royalty across the different patent holders, according to the strength of their portfolio, and the strength of their patent portfolio will be given by how many patents that have been claim charted and determined essential they have. Now, I'm very skeptical about that valuation method. The alternative, as we know, is comparables. And for the implementation of a comparables analysis, then you don't need to claim chart each and every patent. In fact, all that you would need to determine is that the licensor has a portfolio that is worth licensing. And then you will look at the various different agreements that it has entered into in order to determine the value that should be exchanged in a particular agreement. Now, you could say, well, but comparables works well when you have in litigation, in the context of litigation, because then there is transparency about terms and conditions, but that's a different type of transparency. That's transparency about what the licensing agreements have been entered into. So I think that to summarize, I have nothing against transparency per se, but I think that there is a cost-benefit analysis that needs to be performed. If the objective of all these transparency is to implement the top-down approach, I think that approach to valuation has so many problems that it may not be worthwhile forcing companies to invest this amount of money that Richard has quantified, on a back of the envelope with a back of the envelope approach that seems correct in around 1 billion when the upside is so limited.
And this leads, and Jorge's point is very good, because this leads to the idea that maybe if you want to facilitate actual licensing, which is the goal, right, to get this to be done, then maybe there's a pragmatic or an efficient amount of transparency. What's good enough? There's no absolute transparency that's necessary.
Yeah, this is a little bit what I also felt like summarizing your opinion here, because that one part of at least evidencing that you have essential patents, even though I can agree with Clemens that we all would agree that the big top 10, at least we know, must have some essential patents. But it could solve some of the long tail problems. Non-practicing entities would also have to do that, these kind of things. So you, as an implementer, have maybe a better overview who has actually or potentially has a case against you. And that could maybe create some kind of transparency that would not be unreasonable in terms of costs.
If you think of other mechanisms, Tim, like for example, let's say the long tail would probably be incentivized to join a patent pool. Then this would be handled by the pool. Then it's not. Then the whole issue goes away. Why would we have a whole separate database of claim charts when a bunch of people are in the pool, where it's already handled, right? So this is always my point. It sounds good, but is it necessary in relation to other mechanisms?
Yeah, you're 100% right. I mean, pools historically have at least always been a long tail, right? I mean, just recently with Avanci, we see the actual big players join, but that is an interesting one. You're right. I mean, the market has found solutions in many places already.
I think that this idea of the pools is very important and interesting because, I mean, to some extent, you wouldn't be admitted to a club if you don't have the credentials. So in a sense, when licensing takes place through a pool, you could say that the licensees can delegate the decision to verify whether or not the licensor has patents, because that's what the pool is going to check. It's in the incentives of the other members of the pool to make sure that they only admit as a member somebody that has the same credentials.
Because when in the pool, Jorge, right, then it's the actors themselves that are worried that others are there that shouldn't be.
Exactly.
There. So they're managing it among themselves. It's not an issue for the implementers anymore. Yeah.
They keep each other honest.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, how they share the revenue is their business, right? I mean, that they can figure that out. But yeah, that's great. Thank you for your view on this one. But there's calls for other kinds of transparencies, and a bit. I think Richard, in your introduction, you said that actually in cellular we have a lot of information, which I agree. As IPlytics, we know that very well. But for many other standards we don't. And there is a discussion of things like late disclosures, etc., that patents should be early declared, but often they're not specifically declared. Any opinion on the argument of late disclosure, early declarations, disclosures and late declarations?
I think it's easily solved, actually. There's two problems. If you have people disclosing very late, there's the potential for ambush. People adopt the standard and then they discover that there are people who have patents. And it may be that they've not made declarations. They're not necessarily prepared to license them on FRAND terms. And we saw that occur with the IPcom situation, which held a number of patents and initially took the view that we haven't made declarations. We don't have to license these on FRAND terms. There is the other problem, though, is that if you force people to make declarations and disclosures very early, they tend to over disclose. They tend to disclose, the rules are on Etsy is that you have to disclose something that may be or may become essential. So people disclose all sorts of stuff before the standard is necessarily frozen or before the patents are eventually granted in whatever form they are eventually granted in, and you get a lot of noise in the database. But the solution seems to me to be very straightforward. You have rules of a standard setting organization which encourage early blanket declarations, so licensing declarations straight off. So everybody says, whatever I have, if it's a standard essential, I will license it on FRAND terms. And then the SSO can proceed to finalize the standard. And then later, once they know exactly what the standard is that's set, and once their patents have granted and they can see what form they're in, then they start to make late and careful disclosures of the patents. And that, I think, would give you the best data for licensing, but at the same time avoid the problem of ambush, which is what we fear with late disclosure.
And could you remind me, I'm not 100% sure what the Etsy IPR policy says, but I know you can do blanket declarations at Etsy, right? But it's not.
You can. That's right, you can, but not everyone does. And it would avoid the problem of the holdup of the guy who turns up with patents late in the day and hasn't made a licensing declaration.
Right.
I mean, it is the fear. It is the fear of this late declaration. I mean, I think it was the Rambus case that first put this on the radar and made everyone start to make sure to disclose or to declare early. and that created a lot of, that created the large amount of patents that are there, which of course is good for the SDO, and that's why Richard's idea of blanket is the best for an SDO. Then they don't have to worry at all.
Yeah, I think the SDO doesn't have to worry, but I mean, still from my perspective as looking at data, I would love to have the IEEE or the ITVT encouraged to have more specific declarations, which is legally I'm 100% agreeable to having blankets early on, but I think at least the industry should have a more specific understanding, even though we have to be, transparent about these are just declared patents and not verified as central, but the magnitude of portfolios maybe at least, or to a certain extent at least, and that is right now beyond the cellular space, which is actually a great database in that regard, is really missing, right?
I completely agree. I mean, this is the difference between declaration, which is the preparedness to grant a license, and disclosure, which is what you say the patent is essential to. And the more specific the disclosure you can encourage, the better. I would like to see disclosures to specific paragraphs of standards, and that be encouraged as much as possible. And to a certain extent, also that solves the claim chart problem as well. If people are giving very specific disclosures, then that's most of the way to a claim chart.
Yeah, I would love to see that. If you can actually disclose the claim and the section that potentially could be essential, it will be a first step. I mean, some patent pools do it actually, and it's quite good information to retrieve that. The other final one of transparency issues that has been requested goes a bit where we're discussing to Jorge when we're looking at a comparable license, and there has been the request that NDAs, or the credit system at least, that NDAs have provisions that are really far going, and basically you don't you cannot really see other licensing contracts. There's no transparency if the comparable license that the licensor offers is actually comparable, or that if they should be others they should have looked at. What is your take on transparency with regards to NDAs in these licensing negotiations?
So there, let me start by saying that I think that the danger of increasing transparency along those dimensions is that you may end up restricting the flexibility of the licensor to make concessions that are tailored to the needs of a particular licensee. A licensor is not going to offer a concession if that means that it has to apply that concession to everybody else. I mean, by increasing transparency, we may end up in a situation that is akin to one in which we have MFNs. And I think that would be counterproductive. That would take, in a sense, the requirement of licensing on non-discriminatory terms way too far. I understand why people want that sort of transparency, but I would, ask licensees to think carefully and be careful with what they wish, because it may end up being counterproductive. I think it would be much more logical for them to request, some transparency as to the basic licensing terms, or royalty rate programs, etc. So as to get a sense of where are the royalties that the licensor in question is agreeing to. But as Clemens mentioned before, FRAND is a range. So getting precisely to the number that has been agreed in a particular deal would require to understand each and every other element of that deal. And my concern is that actually when people look at that information, they don't try to buy the whole package. They don't say, I want a license exactly like that. What they want is the best possible terms along each of the dimensions that others have negotiated.
I know from earlier discussions that you said the perfect transparency is never good for society. What is your take on these NDAs and things like that?
I mean, we have NDAs. I mean, so the idea sometimes I wonder when we talk about transparency is that people think that more is always good, and of course we know that's not the case. That's why we wear clothes, right? So we have to understand what's the right level here. What's the efficient level? And I think Jorge tried to paint this picture. And of course, on the surface, it's just like the other one. On the surface, it sounds really good. But as Jorge mentioned, you're going to start people, FRAND is another one. FRAND says we need to specify FRAND. No, it's wonderfully vague, right? It's just right. And it allows for their customization to be done and things to happen between parties that aren't exactly the same, because people are heterogeneous in the value chain. So again, if some terms will be for some person, some for other, they can all be FRAND, but as soon as you see those, you will start to want everything that everyone else wants, and you may end up, again, because of too much transparency, creating more deadlock. So this has to be thought through. There is a good, we need, I walk my dog at night and not all the blinds are open on my neighborhood. There's a reasonable amount of lack of transparency that's useful in society.
And I think my experience is that it's already a difficult question to decide what are comparable. So, for example, let's just assume somebody wants to conclude a 5G license and he asks for other 5G license agreements. What is about license agreements which cover also other standards? What is about cross licenses? Are they comparable? Because it will already be quite a challenge to give a price tag to the cross license value. You will see rarely an agreement where they say, I pay to you 100, you pay to me 50, so the net is 50. Usually they just say the net is 50 so that everybody can determine for himself what goes one way, what goes the other way. And my experience is also transparency is certainly good to a certain degree, but at one point it doesn't bring you any further. So for example, even let's just assume the ideal situation. We had 100 agreements and everybody, it's just a straight one-way license. Everybody has the same past liability and release, whatever. Everybody pays exactly the same rate, €1 per device. Even then, the potential licensee will tell me why this should not apply to him, because he is different, because his average sales price is lower, because his markets are in regions where patent coverage is less, because whatever, he's a nicer nose than me, which is not difficult. But you see all kinds of possibilities why this transparency in the end is good, but it will not do by itself the job.
So I noticed on the comments there's a comment that nobody's in pro-transparency. I'm actually pro-transparency, and I'll explain why. If you have a closed market, in other words, people can't see what's going on in the negotiations, it allows people to compromise, and somebody can have a strong position on something, but for this particular deal they will come down, and the other guy for this particular deal will come up, and they will reach an agreement. And that only works so long as the two compromising parties know that that everybody else in the industry is not going to see the concession that they've made, because by doing that they can get away with it. If you have a completely transparent market, and the housing market in the UK is an example of that, because you can go onto any website, you can go onto a website and see what any house has been sold for on any street, and you can see exactly how much the seller came down in price, and you can see exactly how much the buyer went up. That's a completely transparent market, and it works in housing because people only ever make one housing transaction at a time. I don't mind people knowing that when I sold my house, I accepted £50,000 below the asking price, because I'm not going to sell another house in the near future. So I can get away with it. But if it's a repeat transaction, I would hold and I would stick to my asking price, because if I compromise, I know I'm going to have to compromise on every future deal. So the problem with transparency is great for getting more information about what other people do, but it reduces the amount of compromise and the scope for compromise. And this is why I'm in favor of it, because I'm a litigation lawyer. And so I want people to be unable to compromise, because then that gives me more litigation business. So you can see the downside of it, but you can also see the upside.
I think it's also important that we need to live in a world where you're not just anti-transparency or pro-transparency. My argument is just the right amount of transparency. That's what you need. You need just the right amount. We can't have this thing where we believe that if everything was transparent, there would be no problems, and we would just stop talking about FRAND and everything would just be wonderful. And that's not the case. In fact, having more transparency in one direction or too little transparency in the other, both directions can make things worse. Why can't we agree that there's the right amount, right? And what should that be?
And I agree with that. I think that, as I mentioned before, I think that one thing is to say that you're going to disclose every single term and condition in all licensing agreements that have been entered into. And another thing is to request people to have royalty programs, for example, royalty rate programs, where they say, we're going to enter into agreements within this range. And there is another way in which companies can achieve or obtain greater transparency, which is that if they are in disagreement, they can arbitrate. And if there is arbitration, there is going to be, those contracts will be revealed. I am sometimes puzzled about why some licensees are so against arbitration these days. I used to be in favor in the past, but these days they are so much against arbitration, where they can get that transparency and prefer, on the contrary, to get into patent by patent, jurisprudence by jurisprudence, jurisdiction by jurisdiction litigation.
I think if we think about licensing in different industries, I think that for some deals that are really complex, two large players, one of the largest SEP holders and one of the largest, let's say, smartphone manufacturers, that they have very complex negotiations around the world is one thing. But if you think a bit more into the future, we have the automotive industry, but also IoT. For automotive, it's actually pretty transparent. A large share of the SEPs are licensed for $15, on a publicly available pricing on a website even. Do you think for IoT that this kind of transparency, or even maybe something even more ex ante, is possible? Because the dynamics of other industries are much different than the smartphone industry?
I can start with that one. I raised this issue a bit in the beginning. I think that these different industry verticals have different norms, and they're used to doing things the way that they've done things. Because of the FRAND agreement, people can start to ship products very quickly, even before licenses are done. And if that starts happening under the norms of the vertical, before there's a discussion between how this is going to happen, then you start to get issues. So you want to start early. But there's opportunities to solve this. Now, I think the Avanci reference is a good one, because a lot of the things that people complained about in licensing and cellular is resolved through the Avanci license. It's a one fee. You don't have to worry about the transparency because you get everything for this one fee. It's solving a lot of these issues. So the question is, if you're worried about all the things we've just been talking about, why don't you take a license from Avanci, because it solves it all? So I was surprised that the auto industry didn't say that this was good, because this was the thing that people in the past were arguing, if we had this would be great.
So one place where transparency is good and where it's worked well is where you have the competition between standards. And I'm thinking of the example of LTE and WiMAX, where people where the carriers were choosing which technology to adopt. And those people who had the patents in LTE did tend to make forward-looking statements about what they would expect to charge, or what they would expect that aggregate royalty would be on handsets. And that has proved to be extremely useful. It has given the ability or some certainty for people to negotiate, and there are many cases that look and refer to those aggregate statements as a cross-check against the other licensing that's happening. So that sort of transparency is a good idea. The difficulty is that I was talking about earlier is the individual transparency, where a licensor or a licensee feels unable to compromise because it will later be used against them. And that's where that level of transparency, I think, probably hampers negotiation rather than helps it.
But is your expectation that with IoT we will see more tools and more, maybe even very early licensing public declarations even? Is that something that you could see for the future as, of one way to get to it? But because my gut feeling is, and correct me if I'm wrong, that many of the largest SEP owners, when it goes to automotive and even IoT, they don't, have their large licensing teams going out. They don't have their litigation teams going out. They rather pool. They rather give their patents even to someone else. And they all agree on a lump sum, which, is also something new. Is that something we will see more, do you think?
That would be my
so, yes.
expectation.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, that would be my expectation. And I think that is a transaction cost issue. And I think that clearly indicates that the reason why you get into pools or you don't get into pools is not typically due to opportunistic motivations. It's just a question of transaction costs. I think that if the upside of individual negotiations is limited and the cost of having many of these individual negotiations is high, then you would prefer to go and pool with others, even if that means that perhaps you are getting less for your high quality portfolio. that's a cost minimization issue.
I don't want to speak on behalf of the licensors, but it would seem that there's like a discontinuous moment here in a way that things are exploding with, we plan for them to explode in IoT. And so there's going to be so many more actors working with this, but we don't know all the use cases yet. So this slows things down a little bit about pricing. But this idea that because of this explosion and the same technology can be used in more places, it allows for more pooling and less, the transaction costs of bilateral are too high. You can pool more, and that might make things much easier because of that. Most people always extrapolate. They said, oh, it was problematic in cellular, it's only going to get worse in IoT. No, sometimes when the scale goes up, people find new solutions that make it easier, because it doesn't matter how many patents you have. If they're all in the pool, then it's easy, right? So I think that we can see this coming, but maybe Clemens can talk on that. Put him on the spot.
Yeah, let's say it's a different market, of course, and these are new challenges. And we see that, let's say, the handset market and also the automotive market are relatively easy, because you can, with a number of big companies, cover 80–90% of the market. In the IoT, that will be different. You will probably have many SMEs, startups, which sell 500 connected toasters or 200 connected flower pots per year. And I know that, of course, it's terrible for those if they get approached by 100 patent owners, or and then the other way around, for the 100 patent owners, it doesn't make sense, because the transaction costs are too high if they want to start litigating or even approaching all these small ones. So therefore, we must think about new ways how we can, let's say, ideally with low transaction costs and a lot of transparency, a lot of legal certainty, make sure that we cover the broad majority of that market. These are new challenges, and then a lot of ideas are being discussed about pools, about component module licensing, and so on. I think it's still too early. At least we don't have a licensing program yet, and we have not yet made these decisions. But we are aware of the challenges, and you can believe us that our aim is definitely to license as many as possible for with little transaction costs, and then in a transparent and in a foreseeable way, to have also fair competition between the various market participants.
Mm-hmm. And in that direction, I think also when you think about where to license in the value chain, one of those topics that is always people like to discuss. I think also that will be something that we could rethink in the future. I mean, I see very well the argument. You have to kind of understand where the technology ends up to understand what kind of value it creates. But even if you think in an IoT, and the OEM market is your long tail. It's all these small startups, these small, medium-sized companies, and those module or chip manufacturing companies, however, what stage they are in the value chain, are the bigger ones. They are the ones that you can actually grasp. It may even make sense to license those, right?
Yeah, it's absolutely possible to make a mixed approach, that you say for everybody above a certain threshold, we do it on the end device level, and then for the entire long tail, we make it through an association, through whatever. There's a number of possibilities available, and as I said, we have to really to observe how the market will develop before we can make any decisions here. But these are absolutely the right questions. And as I said earlier, if we could agree on the value of the connectivity, then I think it will also make things easier on the licensing side. So I think that is maybe a necessary pre-step.
One of the problems with this point of licensing argument is that it confuses a couple of things. The whole value chain gets a license of some sort or another. In other words, the whole value chain gets consent to work the patents. What the argument is about is not who gets the license, because the reality is everybody gets some sort of consent. What the argument is about is who it is in the value chain who enters the agreement and pays the royalties. So it's who is the agreeing party, not who is the licensed party. I think everybody agrees that having a single person in the value chain enter the agreement and pay the royalties is most economically efficient. And I think everybody agrees that it doesn't matter which person it is in the chain who does it, they're going to pay the same price. And I don't think there is a problem with a value chain deciding amongst itself that the person who's going to go and take a license for the whole chain is this one here. And that works fine. The problems only arise when everybody in the value chain is pointing at each other. and the end user product manufacturer is saying, no, someone down there should take the license, and the guy down there is saying, well, I can't afford to because I haven't got the profit margin, so you need to go and talk to the guy up there. So if there is an agreement, and so long as everybody's priced it in, it doesn't really, I don't think it really matters.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. There's one issue raised here by the audience. It's about pools, and there has been, or there are situations, I think in particular in video coding, where there's multiple pools, and we even recently had a case of what people call double dipping. So someone pays, twice for the same patents. What is your opinion on that? Are multiple pools a real bad thing, or is it also going to reduce transaction costs?
Personally, I think is sorry, Richard, go ahead. Last time I took the lead.
I was going to let you comment, because actually, Jorge, what I was going to say is that there introduces some degree of competition, but then I realized that's probably an economist argument, and I should let you do it.
Well, I think that it depends on, if we have multiple pools, it depends whether they are, purely complementary or not. Whether their patent holdings are, are exclusive, and what you have is kind of an exhaustive partition of all the patents in a series of pools, or there are overlaps. If they are complementary, which is what I would expect normally to occur, then I think that on the one hand, they are going to be reducing transaction cost as if there was a single one. There would be further reductions in transaction cost if you had only one. But there may be reasons why you have multiple pools emerging. And that may be because, the patent holders are very heterogeneous. And so, for example, you may have a group that has, very high quality portfolios, and others that have, less strong portfolios. It's normal that, you then have pools emerging that group people that are relatively homogeneous. Why? Because, that facilitates the sharing agreements and so on and so forth. It facilitates a number of difficult decisions that pools have to make. So I think that provided that their patents are complementary, I don't see any problem with the emergence of multiple patent pools. In fact, it may facilitate the emergence of pools, as opposed to trying to mandate a single pool, which could or prove impossible because of the heterogeneity that I was referring to before.
And I think we have some examples, at least in the history, of MP3 or AVC, which were really successful pools and successful technologies too, that even, if we have more than one pool in the industry, that works. And we have to always think pools are never perfect. I mean, I've never seen a pool for one standard that covers all patents. So you will always have a situation where you have a pool and bilateral licensing. So the number of pools, I think, shouldn't really, if it reduces, as you said, transaction costs, it really is about, what's left in bilateral licensing. So I think that would be at least my take on that. We are anyways not talking about perfect worlds here.
But of course, the pools pools have certainly big upsides, but they of course also create new problems. For example, we see quite a lot of legal disputes between pool administrator, pool members, or between the pool members. So these are then just kind of new territories to fight. And the second point is, let's say, the nice thing in the automotive industry is that, to my knowledge, none of the automotive makers has any substantive SEP patent pool. So this means, therefore, patent portfolio. So this means there was never an issue about cross-licensing, because that is also an opportunity which you don't have if you deal with a pool. And that is the reason, at least for us, that with the big other companies, players in the telecommunication industry, it is at the moment best to have directly cross-license, where we can, in the end, also achieve a license under their patents and then agree on a balancing payment. But as I said, there are upsides. There are also strong upsides for the pools, and especially in new businesses where cross-licenses takes a smaller role, this might indeed be something worth considering.
And you should note too that not everyone that owns SCPs will license because of different reasons. So just because not everyone's in the pool doesn't mean that the pool doesn't actually cover all the entities or most of the entities that actually will license. So.
Yeah, the actual analysis will be does they cover all licensing programs, right? I mean, you're 100% right. I mean, we all know that many implementing companies have large SEP portfolios for the pure reason of cross-licensing, and they don't have a license program to go out with. These are great discussions. Would love to spend the last minutes on something, because there's a lot of discussion about transparency, value chain. The big question to me is regulation is in the middle of all that. What is your belief on that? Should there be regulations? We had public consultations this year from different countries, US, Europe, UK. What is your take on that? Is what they're trying to, of course, improve the system, but what is there to be improved, and is it needed?
So I suppose that there is, of course, already quite a lot of regulation. When we start from the question of should there be, well, of course there should be, and there is. The question is whether we need more or different. And the starting point should be, is there a market failure? We should be starting to see if the market's working, then fine. If there's clear evidence of market failure, then yes, we're going to need to change or amend or alter. But the trick with all regulation is light touch and accepting when you make regulation that you can't predict the future. And whatever you write down some circumstance will come up, which then makes it not work. So you have to try and adopt the lightest touch and the most general approach so as to take account of whatever's coming.
I think personally that the system at the moment works relatively good. I mean, at Nokia, we have in the last years concluded, I think, around 160 license agreements, and only 6, I think, were the result of litigation. The others were concluded really on the table. Sometimes you keep losing this kind of overall picture just because it's litigation is what many people speak about, what has been reported publicly. Very few people speak about all these silent agreements which are concluded absolutely without any noise. So therefore, I think the system is working relatively good. Of course, there's always room for improvement, but legislation, in my view, has really made it much better. And we can look at other industry in the energy sector and in many other sectors where there is regulation by authorities, and I'm not sure that this is working any better there. So therefore, I think ideally people talk to each other, try to find solutions, and then try to apply industry practices. And usually the industry is able to solve these issues. And I think that should definitely be the first try before we call for the legislator.
So my personal concern is that, we are seeing a bit of confrontation between different parts of the globe, with courts in different parts of the globe. I think that we are seeing a race to court, and with different jurisdictions fighting with each other in terms of who's going to decide, for example, on a global royalty rate, and we are seeing some developments there in terms of the use of anti-suit injunctions or anti-suit injunctions and so on and so forth. And I think that is potentially problematic, because there is a risk that standards may end up being fragmented as a result. And I don't think that would be good. I don't think that having standards in China and standards in the West and fragmentation along those dimensions is a good outcome, because that would, of course, lead to these economies of scale and would, eventually have negative impacts on innovation. I think that the idea of having global standards is a good idea and has proved very fruitful. And I'm concerned that, some actions, I'm not sure whether they are regulatory actions or who's ultimately behind those developments, but I'm concerned that there is the potential for fragmentation, between the West and China, and I think that we should stop that from happening, or try to stop that from happening.
Just quickly, Tim, I start out as an engineer, so when I hear the word failure, I think that the bridge is in the river, right? So I don't think that there's a hypothetical crack that could happen in the future, which we could possibly solve if we've done something else that we haven't done yet. So if we take this idea, is there a market failure? It's hard to say that there's a large market failure in cellular. Nepalese farmers have mobile phones, right? We have more subscriptions than we have people on the planet. This goes back to what Richard said, is that, so I think as long as we say that things are going good and how can we improve them, and how can the government facilitate market actors to solve these issues, and how can the government provide information? Now the EC is asking for evidence. I think that's good. My argument is, why not 20 years ago? Why are we waiting so long for evidence? But let's get evidence out there and let's make decisions based on evidence, but not evidence of an intermediate problem, evidence of something actually wrong from a welfare perspective, and that you just don't see. So I would be a bit nervous to do a large regulatory change where we don't know what would happen. I would hope that private actors can come together and solve these things on the margins.
And I think also Jorge made a good point. Regulators are in a way always local, right? We have the US, we have Europe, we have the UK, we have China. You know, probably what was actually needed is that we have a standard that is global, because we have a global market. So any regulation that will happen for that very specific country or region, right? And that is then also going to be changing how things are treated in one market or another, right?
What does it help if we have a European process to set a FRAND rate if the Chinese court just sets a different one?
Right.
And faster.
And there we would like to see no rule of law. So all these things, like when you say what the government should do, rule of law, property rights, contracts. And so certainly if someone files an anti-suit injunction in Wuhan and it's done without any transparency and we don't know what's going on, their transparency is critical, because that's on the level of rule of law. Now, when we get to the level of market actors working together, we have a huge amount of collective activity going on already. STOs, FRAND, patent pools. This is quite a lot of collective activity that's produced a lot of value. So let's build on strength.
Great.
There's your tagline. That's what you wanted in the beginning, right?
I was going to say, I want one in the end too, Bo, and you're going to be the first because you asked for it. I would love to have your final statements. We are at the hour. What do you want the audience to be remembering from you? Bo, you can go ahead, get started.
Well, I think, so I think there's an opportunity now to look at the things that, to agree that, as Richard said, cellular has done rather very well in many ways, and what can we learn from that to improve, and how can market actors work together to do this, and how can regulators support them with data to pull this off? That would be my message.
Great, thank you so much. Jorge, you want to go next?
Well, what I would say is I would restate my main concern these days. And my main concern these days is that we may end up with fragmented standards because of diverging regulations in different parts of the world. I think that we should avoid that from happening. I think that how do we do that? I think that, of course, there are political dimensions that way exceed perhaps the paycheck of all of us here involved. But I think that if we get a little bit more clarity on how to value patent portfolios, more clarity about what are the right methods and what are the wrong methods, perhaps we could then help to create the level playing field across the world that I think that is necessary to take advantage of the economies of scale that exist in this industry.
Great, thank you so much. Richard, you want to go next?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I talked at the beginning about how much we know today on cellular compared to how little we knew in 2006 when I was starting all of this in the industry. So much of that has come about through webcasts like this, through services like yours, Tim, IPlytics, like Pattern, which is a similar service we have at Bird & Bird, looking into these portfolios and finding out the information about them. And it's this sort of thing that works and makes the work, makes it all much easier for us to understand and navigate our way around. If we could have this in Wi-Fi, in all of the other standards, that would really promote understanding. And that's what I'd like to see. I would like to get to a point where if somebody asks me to value a Wi-Fi portfolio, I'm as able to do it as I am for a cellular.
Did you ask him to say that, Tim? Come on, that was very nice.
I didn't pay him.
No, I thought I should be nice to Tim.
You owe me. Great, thank you, Richard. And Clemens, last but not least, your final remarks.
Yeah, of course, I can only add to Richard that you, Tim, give a very valuable service, which helps a lot here to come to more clarity and also to results. Indeed, I think it is important that really both sides act in good faith, but people talk to each other, try to understand each other. We have seen a lot of decisions and a lot of agreements, which all, let's say, give us more certainty. And I'm very confident that with each decision, with each agreement, there will be less things to argue about. And so that therefore we will also have less disputes in the future. For me, it is very important that, let's say, licensing does not mean the race to the most favorable court, but rather kind of a dialogue, and which is really result driven, and which gives, and accepting that there's some legal uncertainty, but still let's try to come to results rather than to fight.
Thank you so much, Clemens, and thank you all of you for your very valuable, insightful contributions here. I think my summary and last take is that I think transparency is really an issue that we have to discuss. This panel is not against it per se, but it has to be balanced and it has to be done right. And there's more to come. I think the future will tell what we will do in IoT and what kind of solutions we will find. And I'm excited to see that. Thank you very much. Thanks for everyone who registered and called in, and for all your questions. If we're not able to answer all of them, we will follow up. I will also share them with the panel. Thank you for joining, and you have a great day. Take care and bye.
Thanks, Tim. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Stay safe. Bye-bye.